Hi, welcome to IE. We're going to start a book together today called White Monster. Um, should be a pretty good book. As I read today, I want you to think about how you're similar to Jordan or how you are different than Jordan, and you'll answer that question in your Canvas page. It was cold, so cold. Jordan Ames had never felt such cold in all his life. Everywhere he looked, he saw white. Jordan and his friend, Lee Lewis, sat shivering in the front seat of Jordan's stalled car. It had been sunny and cool early in the day down in the lowlands where they lived. The forecaster had predicted that a small storm system would move through that afternoon, and as the boys had left town it had been raining lightly. As they drove into the mountains, the light rain had turned into snow. But who would have imagined this much snow? Who would have thought that they'd run into a blizzard that would trap them in the middle of nowhere in the belly of a white beast? This reminds me of that book we read from history last year, Lee said grumly. Remember that one about the Donner Party? Those people in the wagon train headed for California in the mid 1800s? It just kept snowing down on them until they were almost buried alive. They were trapped for months, and in the end, some of them got so hungry that they ate those who died. That's how bad it got. Jordan had read that book too, but he didn't want to think about it. Not only did it remind him how serious their situation was quickly becoming, but it also caused his hatred for school to well up like a rising tide inside him. Jordan hated school. He hated every class and every teacher, and he hated being forced to read a book, whether it was good or bad. He just wanted out of that prison that they called high school. And how he had ended up in this situation? That morning, when Jordan and his father had argued heatedly over school. "You're getting a D in environmental biology?" his dad had thundered. "That's unacceptable." Mr. Ames was a large African American man who had beaten the odds to become successful. When he was Jordan's age, he had been busted for petty burglary and had spent several months in the juvenile correction center. But then he had turned himself around. He had gotten a job and paid for his own college education. Later, he had started his own machine parts factory, and now he employed 40 people. Jordan's dad knew the price a young man, especially a young black man, paid for ignorance and idleness. He wanted his son to avoid having to pay that price as he had. He wanted Jordan to be successful. He wanted him to graduate from high school, to go to college, to get a good job, and to have a good life. Jordan did not want that for himself. He just wanted to be happy. Hanging out with his friends and playing basketball was just fine with him. Jordan knew he was a goof off, but he didn't care. He lacked his dad's ambition, but he also lacked his dad's uptightness. He guessed he'd rather be a happy goof off than an uptight success. His dad had gotten very angry that morning. He told Jordan that starting this week, he was grounded for 2 weeks. Other than school, he could not go anywhere, not with his friends, not with his girlfriend, nowhere. He would have to sit in the house, study, and listen to his father's lectures. Jordan wasn't about to do that, so at lunchtime that day he had ditched school, picked up his buddy Lee, then they headed for the mountains on a joyride. Lee was a dropout, so it didn't matter to him. He told Jordan he was just glad for something to do. Jordan really hadn't thought about what they were going to do once they got to the mountains. He was the kind of guy who didn't really plan anything. He did things on the spur of the moment. They had stopped for a cheeseburger and fries before leaving town. Then they had headed out in the light mist that had just begun. In the back of his mind, Jordan had thought that maybe they would find a cabin where he and his grandfather had camped a few years ago. Then they would live off the land like the old timers did. But he hadn't thought of how they'd live or what they'd eat, or even what they'd do if they didn't stumble across the cabin. He hadn't even brought in a heavy coat or a sleeping bag. Nothing. He just didn't know that he couldn't stand being trapped in the house all weekend while his dad ranted about what a loser he was. "You never look beyond your nose, Jordan," his dad took every opportunity to tell him. Sometimes when his father got on his case, Jordan would look to his mother for support, but usually she would just stand there nodding sadly. She seemed to mostly agree with his dad. According to them, Jordan was a very lucky kid. He had opportunities handed to him on a silver platter. Why couldn't he just take advantage of them? They asked again and again. I wish I would have dressed warmer, Lee said, rubbing his arms. I'm freezing in this t-shirt. Jordan glanced at his friend. He knew that Lee never gave the future much thought either. When the spirit moved him, he went with it. He had dropped out of school in 10th grade and then had become hanging around street corners picking up odd jobs. But at least Lee had a better excuse than Jordan for being a loser. Lee had a messed up home life. His parents had divorced years ago and Lee never saw his father. Miss Lewis, Mrs. Lewis drank too much alcohol and had different boyfriends all the time. Why do you hang out with that Lewis boy? Jordan's dad often demanded to know. He's just bringing you down. You know the saying. Tell me who you're going out with and I'll tell you who you are. Jordan's dad always seemed to have some saying to go with whatever point he was trying to make. Jordan also had on nothing but a t-shirt and jeans. Why hadn't he at least worn a coat or a sweatshirt? He chastised himself. He shivered as the wind howled through the gaps around the old car doors. Hey, Lee, Jordan said suddenly, a thought entering his mind. What if we pulled off the seat covers? We could use them as blankets. Jordan had put seat covers in his car to cover up the threadbare upholstery. His car was an old one, but it was all he could afford. Jordan remembered how he had scraped together birthday and Christmas money to buy it because his father had refused to contribute a penny. You think I'm wasting my money on a car for you? His dad had stormed. No way. If you had any ambition, you'd get a job frying burgers or delivering pizza like other kids your age. But no, you'd rather waste your time playing basketball. Do you think you're going to be some big NBA star someday or something? Well, forget it. You're not going to make squat at basketball. You might have some talent, but you're too lazy to develop it. You got to work hard to be a professional player, and working hard seems to be against your principles. So you might as well go and get yourself some crummy piece of junk car now, because that's the kind of car you're going to be driving all your life. Hey, good idea, Lee agreed, pulling Jordan from his thoughts. Jordan knew his friend had thought of a way to keep warm. Lee wasn't very smart. That was another excuse he had that Jordan didn't have. On the basic skills test, Lee was always at the bottom. Jordan was always at the top. Jordan and Lee got busy pulling off the seat covers, and then they each wrapped one around themselves. The cheap, fake fleece covers weren't the best, but they were better than nothing. I wish we had a sleeping bag, Lee complained as he waited for the seat covers to warm him. I've got a down-filled one at home. Shh, okay, Jordan said. He didn't want to hear about down-filled sleeping bags right now. He looked at Lee then and wondered why he had started hanging out with him in the first place. Lee was his best friend, but why? He wasn't smart, wasn't very good at basketball. Jordan guessed it was because Lee was so easygoing. Lee was the only person in Jordan's life who did not have high expectations of him. Jordan's mom and dad were always nagging Jordan to do better. But Lee accepted Jordan as he was, and since Jordan was better than Lee at most everything, Lee made Jordan feel good about himself. It had been mid-afternoon when they reached the mountains and the snow flurries. Jordan knew now that he should have turned around then and there, but he couldn't stand the thought of going back home, and he had thought for sure he was near the cabin where he and his grandfather had stayed. Everything had looked so familiar. Had he really wanted to see that He had really wanted to see that cabin again. He had kept going, hoping the snowfall would stop, but instead it had gotten heavier and turned dangerous. Against his will, Jordan remembered the Donner Party again. Those poor people couldn't believe how quick the snow had come down. It piled in huge drifts like small mountains, forcing their wagon wheels to a standstill and making it difficult to even walk. The snow became a heavy, wet, smothering monster. That same monster now threatened to devour Jordan and Lee. By the time Jordan had accepted the fact that they better head back, it had been too late. As he was trying to turn around, the car had skidded sideways and slid off the road. He had heard a sickening crunch of his axles striking a rock. Something else must have happened as well because the car had died almost immediately. No matter what Jordan did, he could not restart the car, and now they were trapped in a disabled car with no heat. Jordan had tried to act nonchalant about the whole thing. He had told Lee not to panic, that they'd be out of here in no time, that someone would come along. But nobody did, and the blizzard worsened. The wind picked up and the snow began falling harder than Jordan had ever seen it fall. It was as if someone had an endless supply of confetti and was dumping it by giant handfuls on the mountain. An hour later the road had disappeared. The monster had eaten it and was now gnawing away at Jordan's car. Soon the snow would be up to the windows, and darkness was approaching fast. How could I have been so stupid? Jordan asked himself. He could hear his father's biting words in his mind. You choose to be stupid. A mind is a terrible thing to waste, you know? Hey, this is a little better, Lee said, pulling the seat cover tighter around his shoulders. My arms aren't so cold now. This was a great idea you had. Thanks, Jordan said. He had always enjoyed his superiority over Lee, but now, like everything else to do with this situation, it made him uneasy. Jordan knew that Lee depended on him to get them through this, and Jordan knew, too, that if they were going to survive, he would have to lead the way. Jordan thought about his grandfather again. Unlike Jordan's dad, his grandfather had been an easygoing man, and those 2 weeks in the mountains with him had been the most fun Jordan had ever had. His grandfather had a way of making him feel so special. But the old man had died the next summer, and then there was no one to take Jordan to the mountains any more. No one to make him feel good about himself. It's still snowing, they remarked, looking out the window. Yeah, I see that. Don't you see I can't see that? Jordan snapped. Lee didn't flinch at Jordan's shortness. He just asked in a childlike voice, It'll stop pretty soon. Won't it, Jordan? Jordan sighed. They were both 17, but most of the time Lee acted more like he was 10, like he was a little kid who needed to be reassured that everything was all right. Again, he asked himself why he had ever become friends with Lee. I don't know, Jordan said. He knew that sometimes storms lasted a long time in the mountains. Maybe Jordan feared they were snowed in for the winter. Maybe the road crews and snow plows would not come through again until spring. I wish you had a radio in this car, Lee continued. Then we could find out if anybody's looking for us. Jordan's car did have a radio, but like almost everything else, it was broken. I wish I had a cell phone, Jordan said, but his dad wouldn't let him have a cell phone either. Why do you need a cell phone? Mr. Ames had demanded. So you can run up my bill by talking to your worthless friends? What if I break down the road and I need help? Jordan had pointed out. His dad had scoffed at that. Jordan, you live less than a mile from school. If your car doesn't make it that far, you can walk the rest of the way. My advice to you is don't take that junk piece of car any further than you want to walk if it breaks down. Then you won't need a cell phone. But if I had a cell phone right now, Jordan thought glumly, I could call for help. He wondered if his dad would regret not buying him a cell phone once Mr. Ames found out what had happened. He hoped so. Do you think your parents are worried about you? Lee asked. Jordan shook his head. Not yet. They probably think I'm just shooting hoops somewhere. I can just hear what my dad said when I didn't come home at the regular time. Jordan deepened his voice to his father's rumbling baritone. I told that boy to come home right after school. Now he's grounded for the rest of his life. No more phone calls, no more TV time or using the computer, except for school assignments. In fact, I think I'll strip his bedroom down and throw his mattress on the floor. I'll turn his room into a jail cell. If he wants to act like a criminal by disobeying my rules, I'll treat him like one. Lee laughed. He always laughed when Jordan imitated his father, but Jordan really didn't think it was funny. He was sick of his dad's nagging and tired of being called a loser. Suddenly the wind shook the car as it had not done before. Lee's laughter stopped abruptly, and he looked wide-eyed at Jordan. The wind shrieked through the cracks. It rattled the windows and every part of that ancient car that had worked loose over the years. To Jordan, It sounded like a death rattle. That's the end of chapter 1. I want you to share in Canvas how you are similar or different than Jordan. And make sure you hop on tomorrow and listen to chapter 2 of White Monster.